Welcome to today's deep dive. We are going to be tackling the ethical landscape of social work.
Correct.
It's a really fascinating area, and we're going to be looking at a lecture by Dr. Michael J. Alicea,
Okay.
and it's called Ethical Issues in Direct Work. And it's full of just these thought-provoking concepts
Right.
that really challenge some assumptions about what it means to help people.
It certainly does. One of the most fascinating things that he points out is just the inherent tension in social work's core mission.
Yeah, it's almost paradoxical.
Right.
Right. The goal is to empower clients to eventually not need you
Right.
to become independent. But how do you help someone become independent of your help?
Exactly.
Like, that seems like a really tough
Right.
balancing act.
And the lecture highlights how this dynamic differs from, say, supporting a friend or family member.
Right.
You know, in social work, the relationship is one-sided. The social worker provides support but doesn't receive it in the same way.
Right.
And this creates just this really unique set of obligations.
It makes me think about those times where I've needed help, but also really wanted to maintain my independence.
Yeah.
And, even outside of a professional context, that can be a really tough balance to strike.
Absolutely. And something we can all relate to.
Right.
But in social work, this is just magnified even more.
Right.
And the lecture brings up the idea of going the extra mile,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds positive, but again, there's a fine line between being supportive and overstepping boundaries.
Yeah, it reminds me of this story Dr. Alicea have shared about a social worker who felt pressured to buy groceries for a client
Oh, wow.
who was struggling financially. And, while her intentions were good,
Yeah,
it blurred the lines a little bit.
absolutely.
And it could have created this unhealthy dependency.
That's such a perfect example of why it's so important to reflect on professional boundaries.
Yeah.
The lecture poses some questions for social workers to consider. Is this relationship really about the client's well-being? Are you meeting your own personal needs through professional interactions? These questions can help social workers stay focused on what it means to empower clients rather than fostering that dependence.
I think even outside of social work, we could all benefit from thinking about those questions
Oh, absolutely.
in our relationships.
Yeah.
So good food for thought there.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the lecture also delves into the concept of power dynamics
Okay.
in these helping relationships, and he breaks it down into three types:
Okay.
personal, cultural, and structural.
Okay. Let's unpack those.
Yep.
Starting with personal power.
Okay.
What makes that different from, say, the power that someone has because of their job title?
Well, that's the power that comes from individual qualities.
Okay.
So a social worker's charisma, their confidence, even their ability to connect with others on an emotional level, all of that falls under personal power.
Okay.
And it can be quite potent, especially when you're working with vulnerable individuals.
So even if a social worker is trying to do the right thing, their personal power could unintentionally influence a client's decisions.
Yeah. Precisely. Imagine a social worker who's very persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
They're recommending a particular course of action.
Right.
And a client who's already feeling overwhelmed might agree just because of that social worker's influence,
Right.
not because it's truly in their best interest.
It makes you think about how important self-awareness must be for social workers
Absolutely.
to make sure they're not, unintentionally using their personal power in a way that could be detrimental.
For sure. And that awareness becomes even more important when you consider the other types of power.
Okay.
So let's move on to cultural power.
Okay, what is that all about?
Think societal norms and expectations.
Okay.
For instance, Dr. Alicea gives the example of gender stereotypes and how those might impact interactions.
Right.
A client might respond differently to a male social worker versus a female social worker
Yeah.
based on their own cultural background.
Mm-hmm.
So these unconscious biases ingrained in our culture can subtly impact power dynamics.
It's almost like those underlying cultural assumptions create this power dynamic
Yes.
that's not explicitly stated.
Right.
There is still very much present.
Absolutely. It's an undercurrent that's influencing the whole interaction.
It makes me think about how important training and education must be for social workers
Absolutely.
to make sure they're equipped to navigate those subtle but powerful cultural differences.
For sure.
Yeah.
And that brings us to structural power.
Okay, this one sounds a little more straightforward.
It is. This is about authority that's granted by someone's position
Okay.
within an organization or the broader social hierarchy.
Hmm.
So a social worker by the very nature of their role, holds a certain degree of power.
Right.
Because they represent this system of support,
Right.
and they often have the ability to make decisions that significantly impact a client's life.
So even if a social worker is empathetic and genuinely wants to help,
Right.
their position within that system automatically gives them a level of power over the client.
Yeah. Exactly. Imagine a situation where a social worker needs to make a decision about a child's living arrangement.
Wow.
You know, the client, in this case, the child's parent, might feel pressured to agree
Right.
simply because of that power imbalance.
That's a heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
Makes you realize that every decision a social worker makes carries so much weight.
It does. And it's not just navigating an individual client's needs.
Right.
It's representing a whole system
Right.
that holds a lot of power.
It really makes you think about the power dynamics in your own life, too.
It does, and I think understanding these different types of power is so crucial for navigating the ethical complexities of social work.
Yeah.
It's not just about being a good person.
Right.
It's about recognizing how these power dynamics are always at play.
Right.
And using that awareness to make ethical decisions that truly empower clients.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so we've talked about personal power, cultural power, structural power.
Yes.
Now let's shift our focus to another challenging aspect highlighted in the lecture.
Okay.
The ethical dilemmas
Right.
that arise when what are considered right
Yeah.
clashes with maybe legal obligations or professional guidelines.
That was gray area.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Absolutely. He outlines 3 different categories of ethical dilemmas that social workers might face.
Okay.
First, there are actions that are ethical but illegal.
Okay.
And the example he gives is a social worker choosing not to report a known pedophile
Wow.
who's already in prison.
Okay.
She's concerned that reporting could re-traumatize the child
Right.
who she's working with, who's already dealing with the aftermath of the abuse.
That's such a tough spot to be in.
It is.
On one hand, she has a legal and ethical duty to report child abuse.
Right.
But on the other hand, she's trying to protect this child from further harm.
It's a tough one.
Like, how do you even navigate that?
Yeah, it highlights the complexity of these dilemmas.
Yeah.
And then the lecture goes on to talk about actions that are both unethical and illegal, such as not reporting abuse because a social worker isn't aware of proper procedures.
Oh, wow. So that really underscores the importance of education and training.
It does, right?
That makes sure social workers are fully informed about their responsibilities.
Yes.
So they can make those informed decisions,
Yes.
especially in those really high-stakes situations.
For sure. And then finally, there are actions that might be unethical, even though they're technically legal.
Okay.
For example, a social worker providing therapy to a family experiencing domestic violence, even though he lacks the proper training or expertise in that area.
Right.
His intentions might be good, but he could be doing more harm than good.
Yeah, it highlights the importance of knowing your own limitations
Absolutely.
and seeking out additional training or supervision when needed.
For sure.
Right. And it also makes you think about the importance of self-reflection of this field.
Yes.
How can social workers ensure that their own personal values
Yes.
and biases aren't clouding their judgment when they're faced with these challenging dilemmas?
That is a critical question and one we will get to in just a moment.
Okay.
But before we move on, I do want to touch on one specific thing that Dr. Alicea talked about that really resonated with me.
Okay.
He discusses how different social workers approach ethical decision-making. Some rely heavily on intuition,
Oh.
while others prefer a more systematic analytical approach.
Yeah, so there's no like one-size-fits-all
Right.
approach to ethical decision-making, even within the same profession.
Exactly. And I think that diversity of thought can be a real strength.
Right.
It encourages ongoing dialogue,
Mhm.
and it challenges us to consider different perspectives,
Yeah.
which is so crucial when dealing with these complex issues.
It makes me wonder how individual social workers can ensure that they're using the best possible approach
Right,
for each situation.
right.
Is it about finding a balance between intuition and analysis?
Yeah,
Or is it more about knowing your own strengths and weaknesses
right.
as a decision maker?
Yeah. These are great questions to ponder as we continue our exploration of social work ethics.
Okay, so stay tuned. We will be right back after a quick break. You know, it's fascinating to think about how different personalities might approach these ethical dilemmas.
Right?
Do you think someone who's like naturally analytical might struggle with situations that require more of a gut feeling?
It could definitely go both ways, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a highly analytical person might overthink things
Right.
and get kind of lost in the weeds,
Right.
while someone who's more intuitive might jump to conclusions
Yeah.
without really fully thinking through the implications.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if there's a way to kind of cultivate both of those skill sets,
Yeah.
to become more well-rounded as an ethical decision maker.
I think that's the ultimate goal, right?
Yeah.
To find a balance
Right.
between those two approaches.
Yeah.
And that's where self-reflection comes in,
Right.
which is something Dr. Alicea emphasizes throughout the lecture.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's dive into that. What are some of the key takeaways from the lecture regarding self-reflection?
One of the biggest points is that social workers need to be acutely aware of their own values
Okay.
and how those values might influence their professional decisions.
Right.
It's about recognizing your own biases and blind spots.
Yeah, because we all have our own unique perspectives and experiences that shape how we see the world,
Right.
right? And those perspectives can be valuable,
Absolutely.
but they can also lead to these unconscious biases
Sure.
if we're not careful.
Absolutely. And in social work, where you're dealing with people's lives,
Yeah.
well-being, it's crucial to make sure those biases aren't leading to decisions
Right.
that could be harmful or unfair.
So how can social workers develop that level of self-awareness?
Right.
Is it something you can just learn from a textbook?
I think it's definitely an ongoing process. It's
Right.
a lifelong journey of self-discovery,
Okay.
but there are definitely tools and techniques that can help. The lecture highlights the value of having a mentor or supervisor who can provide feedback and accountability.
Right. So it's like having someone you trust
Exactly.
to call you out on your blind spots
Yeah.
and help you see things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And the lecture also talks about the importance of seeking out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
Whether that's through reading, attending conferences,
Right.
or simply engaging in conversations with people from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
The more we expose ourselves to different ways of thinking,
Right.
the more we can challenge our own assumptions
Yeah.
and become more open-minded and self-aware.
It makes me think about how important it is to create that culture
Yes.
of open communication and feedback
Yeah, absolutely.
within these organizations.
For sure.
If social workers feel comfortable sharing their struggles
Right.
and seeking guidance from their colleagues,
Yeah.
they're more likely to make ethical decisions that benefit everyone involved.
A supportive and collaborative work environment is essential
Yeah.
for ethical practice.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of self-reflection, seeking out diverse perspectives.
Yes.
What other tools or strategies does Dr. Alicea recommend for navigating these ethical dilemmas?
He talks about understanding the ethical codes and guidelines that govern social work practice.
Right, so like a roadmap to
Exactly.
help you kind of navigate
Yeah.
those tricky ethical crossroads.
Yes. And these codes provide a framework
Oh.
for ethical decision-making and can be a really valuable resource
Okay.
when you're faced with challenging situations. But blindly following those codes isn't enough.
Okay.
Social workers need to be able to think critically
Right.
and apply those principles
Right.
to the unique circumstances of each case.
Yeah, so it's not just about knowing the rules.
Right.
It's about knowing how to interpret them
Exactly.
and apply them in a way that's truly ethical and compassionate.
Precisely. And that requires a deep understanding of the ethical principles that underpin social work.
Okay, like what?
Well, things like respect for autonomy,
Okay.
beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice.
Okay, let's break this down a bit.
Okay.
What does respect for autonomy actually mean in practice?
That means honoring a client's right to make their own decisions,
Okay.
even if those decisions aren't what the social worker would choose.
So it's about empowering clients to take control of their own lives.
Exactly.
Even if it means, making choices that you might personally disagree with.
Even if it seems risky or unconventional.
Okay.
And then there's beneficence.
Okay, what's that?
That means acting in the best interests of the client,
Okay.
even if it means putting your own needs aside.
So it's about putting the client's well-being above all else.
Yes. Then there's non-maleficence,
Non-maleficence.
which means avoiding actions that could harm the client,
Right.
both physically and emotionally.
So minimizing those potential risks.
Yeah.
And making sure that your interventions are actually helping,
Exactly.
not hurting.
And then finally, there's justice,
Okay.
which means ensuring that all clients have equal access to resources and opportunities,
Right.
regardless of their background or circumstances.
It's about advocating for fairness and equality
Yes,
and challenging systems that perpetuate injustice.
precisely. Those are the core ethical principles
Right.
that guide social work practice,
Okay.
and they provide a framework for navigating those complex dilemmas that we've been discussing.
Yeah, it makes you realize that social work is so much more than just providing services.
Absolutely.
It's about upholding this whole set of values and principles
Yes.
that aim to empower individuals and create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. And that's why ethical decision-making is such a crucial aspect.
Mm-hmm.
It's about ensuring that social workers are using their power responsibly and ethically.
Right, and it's not just about following the rules.
Right.
It's about understanding those underlying values and
Right.
principles.
Exactly. It's like having this moral compass
Yeah.
that can guide you through those gray areas.
Yeah, it's almost like becoming an ethical detective in a way.
Right.
Carefully examining the evidence,
Yeah.
considering different perspectives,
Uh-huh.
and then ultimately making that decision that aligns with those values and principles.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point that Dr. Alicea raises in his lecture,
Okay.
the impact of technology on ethical practice.
This is something that's been on my mind a lot lately.
It's a big one.
It feels like technology is changing everything so rapidly.
Yes,
And it's hard to keep up with all the ethical implications.
for sure. And the lecture specifically focuses on telehealth,
Okay.
which has become increasingly prevalent in
Mhm.
recent years, especially since the pandemic.
It's like overnight, everyone had to adapt to
Exactly.
providing services remotely.
Yeah,
And that created a whole new set of ethical considerations.
absolutely. One of the biggest concerns is client privacy. How do you ensure that information is protected
Right.
when you're communicating online or through video conferencing?
It makes me think about all those stories you hear about data breaches
Yes.
and hacking.
Exactly.
It's scary to think that someone's personal information could be compromised
Right.
just because they're seeking help.
Absolutely. And the lecture talks about how social workers have a responsibility to educate their clients
Okay.
about the potential risks
Okay.
of using technology
Right.
and to obtain informed consent.
So it's about having those conversations
Yes.
with the client about the limitations of telehealth
Exactly.
and making sure they understand the potential risks.
And it's about taking steps to protect their data.
Okay.
Using secure platforms, encryption,
Right.
making sure you're following all the privacy regulations.
It sounds like there's a lot to consider.
There is.
It's almost like social workers have to become tech experts overnight
Right.
just to keep up with all the ethical implications.
It's a steep learning curve,
Hmm.
but the lecture also talks about how technology can be a powerful tool for good.
Right.
It can increase access to services for people in rural areas or
Right.
who have mobility issues.
Okay.
And it can also facilitate communication and collaboration among social workers,
Yeah.
which can lead to better outcomes for clients.
That's a good point. So it's like any tool,
Right.
technology itself isn't inherently good or bad.
Exactly.
It's all about how we choose to use it.
Exactly. And that's where ethical decision-making comes in.
Yeah.
Social workers need to weigh the benefits against the risks
Right.
and make choices that prioritize the client's well-being and autonomy.
It makes me think about social work education programs.
It's-
How important it is for them to incorporate this into the curriculum.
Absolutely.
So new graduates are prepared to handle these challenges.
For sure. And it's not just about teaching them the technical aspects.
Right.
It's about helping them develop that critical lens for evaluating how technology can be used ethically and responsibly.
It's about equipping them with the tools to be thoughtful and ethical practitioners in this rapidly changing world.
Exactly. And it's about fostering a culture of continuous learning
Yeah.
and adaptation within the profession.
Because it feels like we're constantly playing catch up.
Yes.
But it's a game we can't afford to lose.
Well said. And this discussion about technology brings us back to power dynamics,
Okay.
because technology itself can be a source of power.
Right. How so?
Well, think about all the information that social workers now have access to through technology. They can track client data,
Right.
monitor online activity,
Right.
gather information from all sorts of sources.
Mm-hmm.
This data can be valuable for understanding client needs,
Okay.
but it also raises concerns about surveillance and control.
Right. It's like that double-edged sword.
Exactly.
The more information you have, the more power you have.
Right.
But that power has to be used responsibly.
Absolutely. And that's where self-reflection and ethical decision-making come in again.
Yeah.
Social workers need to be aware of the potential power imbalances
Right.
that technology can create
Right.
and use their influence in a way that empowers clients,
Okay.
not controls them.
It makes me think about the importance of having clear, guidelines and policies
Yes.
around data privacy
Mm-hmm.
and the use of technology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that clients' rights are protected.
Right.
And that technology is being used to benefit them,
Right.
not harm them.
And those guidelines need to be constantly reviewed and updated
Of course.
as technology continues to evolve.
Yes. It's an ongoing process.
It's like we're all navigating this uncharted territory together,
Right.
trying to figure out how to use these powerful tools ethically.
And that's what makes this conversation so important.
Yeah.
We need to keep talking about these issues,
Hmm.
challenging assumptions,
Right.
and working together to create a future where technology is used to empower individuals and create a more just and equitable society.
Well said. And there's this point in the lecture where Dr. Alicea shares a quote that really resonated with me.
Oh, yeah.
He says, "One of the things that service users value is the quality of the relationship they have with your social worker."
That's so true.
And it's such a powerful reminder that at the heart of social work is the human connection.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get caught up in the ethical dilemmas in the systems.
Right.
But ultimately, it's about people helping people.
Yes.
And that connection, that sense of trust and empathy,
Yeah.
that's what makes it so impactful.
It is. And that's why it's so important for social workers to cultivate those qualities.
Yeah.
Compassion, empathy, genuineness.
It's not just about having the right credentials or knowing the policies.
Right.
It's about being a good human being
Yes.
who genuinely cares
Yeah.
and wants to make a difference.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important concept.
Right.
That Dr. Alicea highlights the role of personal values.
Okay, let's talk about that. How do personal values come into play when making ethical decisions?
It's inevitable that a social worker's values will influence their decisions
Okay.
to some extent.
Right.
You know, we all have our own beliefs about right and wrong,
Yeah.
about what's important in life.
Yeah.
And those beliefs shape how we see the world and how we interact with others.
But how can social workers make sure that their personal values aren't leading to bias
Yeah.
or prejudice in their work?
Right.
Isn't there a risk of imposing your own beliefs on your clients?
That's a really valid concern.
Yeah.
And that's why self-awareness is so crucial.
Okay.
Social workers need to be able to recognize their own values
Yeah.
and biases and understand how those might influence their interactions.
So it's not about pretending to be value neutral.
Right.
It's about being aware of those values.
Yes.
And understanding how they might show up.
Absolutely. And it's about being open to different perspectives, even if those values conflict with your own.
So recognizing that your clients might have very different beliefs and experiences.
And that those beliefs are valid
Right.
and deserve respect.
And being willing to learn and grow from that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that brings us to another important point that
Yeah.
Dr. Alicea makes in his lecture,
Okay.
the importance of supervision
Yeah.
and consultation.
So having that trusted advisor or mentor
Exactly.
who can help you
Yes.
navigate those really tricky situations where you're not sure what to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not a sign of weakness to ask for help.
Right.
It's actually a sign of strength
Yeah.
and professionalism.
It shows that you're committed to doing things the right way.
Exactly. And it can also help prevent burnout
Okay.
and compassion fatigue,
Right.
which are real challenges in this field.
So it's like having a safety net,
Yes.
a support system
Exactly.
to help you stay grounded
Yes.
and centered
Absolutely.
in the midst of all those challenges.
And it can also help you develop your ethical decision-making skills
Right.
and become a more confident practitioner.
So it's a win-win.
It is.
Oh,
It benefits everyone.
Okay. So we've talked about supervision and consultation,
Yes.
and this might seem like a bit of a dry topic,
Okay.
but I want to talk about documentation.
Okay.
Why is documentation so crucial in the context of ethical decision-making?
It's about creating a record
Okay.
of the decisions that were made,
Go.
the rationale behind those decisions, the
Mhm.
factors that were considered.
Mm-hmm.
This documentation can be incredibly valuable
Okay.
if a social worker's actions are ever questioned.
Right. So it's like having that paper trail
Exactly.
to show that you were acting ethically and responsibly.
And it can also be a tool for reflection and learning.
Okay.
You know, by reviewing past decisions, social workers can identify patterns
Okay.
in their ethical decision making
Right.
and areas where they might need to grow.
Like a journal of your ethical journey in a way.
Right.
Right.
And it can also be helpful for supervisors
Oh,
who
yeah.
are providing guidance. Having a clear record of the decision-making process
Mhm.
can help them provide more effective feedback.
So it's like having a shared language,
Exactly.
a way to communicate about ethical issues.
Exactly. And it can also help promote transparency and accountability
Right.
within organizations.
So everyone's on the same page.
Yes.
And there's that consistency
Exactly.
across the board.
And that brings us back to the bigger picture,
Okay.
the role of social work in promoting social justice.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the details
Yes.
of ethical decision-making.
Right.
But we have to remember that these decisions have real-world consequences
They do.
for individuals and for society as a whole.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for social workers to be aware of those systemic factors
Okay.
that contribute to injustice and oppression,
Okay.
and to use their power to advocate for change.
So recognizing that social work isn't just about helping individuals.
Right.
It's about challenging those systems and structures
Exactly.
that perpetuates harm and inequality.
And that's why ethical decision-making is so intertwined with social justice.
Yeah.
It's about using your power responsibly to create a more just and equitable world.
It's about being a force for good,
Yes.
both in your individual interactions
Yes.
and in your broader efforts to challenge those systems.
Well said.
Okay. So that brings us to the end of part 2
Okay.
of our deep dive into social work ethics.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground from self-reflection,
Yeah.
technology ethics to power dynamics,
Yes.
and the role of personal values.
Absolutely.
It's been fascinating.
It has.
And I'm eager to hear what Dr. Alicea has to say in the final part of his lecture.
Me too. I think we're in for some more thought-provoking insights and
Okay.
challenging questions.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture of social work, its role in creating a more just world.
Right.
But I'm curious, how do those ideals translate into everyday practice?
Yeah.
What specific tools or frameworks can social workers use to actually navigate those ethical dilemmas?
Right. Well, in this final part of the lecture, Dr. Alicea does offer some really practical guidance.
Okay.
He introduces this decision-making framework that social workers can use to kind of systematically analyze ethical challenges
Okay.
and then arrive at a course of action that aligns with their professional values.
Okay, so let's break down that framework. What are the steps involved?
Okay, so the first step is to clearly identify the ethical dilemma.
Okay.
So what are those competing values or obligations? What are the potential risks and benefits of different actions?
So you really need a clear understanding of the situation
Right.
before you can even start making decisions.
Exactly. And then the next step is to gather all the relevant information.
Okay.
So this might involve talking to the client, consulting with colleagues or supervisors, reviewing case files, researching laws and policies.
So it's about being thorough and making sure you have all the facts.
Right. It's like building a case file. You need all the pieces of the puzzle before you can see the full picture.
Okay, and once you have all that information, what's next?
Okay, well then you need to identify the stakeholders
Okay.
who will be affected by this decision.
Okay.
So this might include the client, their family members, other professionals, maybe even the broader community.
It's easy to get so focused on the individual client that we forget about that broader context.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to consider the potential consequences for
Right.
everyone involved, not just the client themselves.
Okay, so you've identified the dilemma, gathered the information, considered the stakeholders. What happens next?
Okay, so then the next step is to explore different courses of action
Okay.
and evaluate the potential consequences of each one.
So this is where you really start weighing those pros and cons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're considering the risks and benefits, trying to anticipate how different choices might play out.
Right, and this is a good time to consult with colleagues or supervisors too.
Absolutely. Get their perspectives.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of mental juggling going on.
There is.
Are there any specific tools or techniques
Oh, yes.
that can help with this process?
Yes. The lecture mentions a few. One is called an ethics screen,
An ethics screen.
which is basically a set of questions
Okay.
that can help you identify potential ethical issues.
What kind of questions are on the ethics screen?
So, for example, it asks things like, is this action consistent with my professional code of ethics? Does it respect the client's right to self-determination? Am I acting in the best interests of the client? Are there any conflicts of interest?
It's like a checklist to make
Okay.
sure you're not missing anything.
Exactly. And another tool is a decision-making grid.
Okay. A decision-making grid. What is that?
Basically, you create a grid that lists the different courses of action and then the potential consequences.
Oh, so you can visually map it out.
Exactly.
Kind of see how they compare.
It helps bring some clarity to the process
Right.
and allows you to compare those potential outcomes more systematically.
So these tools can be really helpful for social workers.
They are.
But ultimately, the final decision rests with the individual social worker.
Right. That's right. The framework and the tools are there to guide you.
Yeah.
But you have to use your professional judgment
Right.
and make the choice that you believe is the most ethical and responsible.
And that might not always be clear-cut.
No, sometimes there's no perfect solution. You
No.
have to make tough choices
Right.
based on the information you have and the
Yeah.
values that you hold.
So it's not about finding the right answer.
No.
It's about finding the best possible course of action.
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
about being able to justify that decision,
Okay.
both to yourself and to others.
So that's why documentation is so important.
Right.
It allows you to articulate your reasoning
Yeah,
and defend your choices.
exactly. And learn from your experiences.
It's about creating a transparent and accountable process
Yes.
that ultimately benefits the client.
And the profession.
Okay, so we've talked about those frameworks and tools,
Yeah.
but Dr. Alicea also emphasizes this idea of ongoing reflection and evaluation.
Yes. Ethical decision-making is not a one-time event.
Right.
It's an ongoing process
Right.
of learning and growth.
So it's not enough to just make a decision and move on?
No, you have to reflect,
Yeah.
evaluate the outcomes.
Right.
Think about what you might do differently next time.
So it's about constantly challenging yourself,
Yes.
questioning your assumptions.
Right. Seeking feedback.
Yeah, it sounds like ethical practice in social work is a journey,
It is.
not a destination.
A journey that requires courage and compassion
Hmm.
and a deep commitment to social justice.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into social work ethics.
So I have.
From the power dynamics of those helping relationships
Yeah.
to the complexities of decision-making.
Right.
It's clear that this profession demands a high level of ethical awareness
It does.
and commitment. And it's a commitment that goes beyond just following the rules.
It does.
It's about embodying those values
Yes.
in every interaction,
Yes.
every decision,
Yeah.
every moment of practice.
It's about bringing your whole self to this work with
Yeah.
all your compassion,
Yeah.
integrity,
Mm.
and that dedication to making a difference.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration
And of course,
of the ethical landscape of social work.
it's been a pleasure.
It has. And we hope this has given you some new insights to consider,
I hope so.
as you continue to reflect on these really complex and fascinating issues.
Absolutely.